He did everything by the book. He still died. On a Saturday in Minneapolis, January 24th, 2026, Alex Pretti was shot and killed by immigration agents. He was 37 years old, and according to the reporting, he was lawfully carrying a firearm. That single phrase is where the story breaks open, because the same political machine that brands itself as the fiercest defender of gun rights immediately moved to justify killing a man for exercising one. That contradiction isn't abstract, it's personal. If lawful carry can be redefined as a threat after the trigger is pulled, then the protection you think you have only exists until it becomes inconvenient. The facts are stark. Pretti is dead. Federal agents are defended, and the narrative was locked in almost instantly. But here's the part nobody is saying out loud. This wasn't treated as a tragedy to investigate. It was treated as a liability to neutralize. And in that choice, something much larger than one shooting was exposed. Because two pillars of the same political coalition just collided, and only one was ever going to survive. What happened next matters as much as the shooting itself. Within hours, the event stopped being framed as an open question and started being framed as a settled fact. Alex Pretti wasn't presented primarily as a civilian who died during a federal operation. He was repositioned as a problem that needed explaining away. The focus narrowed fast, not on why agents escalated, not on de-escalation, but on what Pretti was carrying and what that might imply. That framing choice is the story, because this wasn't handled like an isolated incident. It followed a familiar pattern: protect the institution first, define the individual second. Lawful carry was no longer treated as neutral background. It became the centerpiece, a detail pulled forward to absorb the blame. Now zoom out for a second. This didn't happen in a vacuum. It landed inside an administration that sells itself on two promises at once: uncompromising law enforcement and uncompromising gun rights. Most of the time, those promises don't collide. This time they did. So here's the real question to hold on to. When those two priorities crash into each other, which one actually wins? Because the answer didn't come from a court. It came from the messaging. And that's where this story starts to tilt. Here's the claim that quietly took shape in the hours after the shooting, that Alex Pretti wasn't killed because of what he did, but because of what he represented. The shift is subtle but critical. Officials began pointing to the fact that he was armed, emphasizing that he had a firearm and additional equipment, and treating that as inherently suspicious, not illegal. Suspicious. That distinction matters, because the moment lawful possession is framed as intent, the standard changes. Preparedness becomes a proxy for threat. And once that logic is accepted, the shooting no longer needs detailed justification. The presence of the weapon does the work on its own. Listen carefully to how this works. No one needed to prove that Pretti fired a shot. No one needed to show that he aimed a weapon. The argument was that the equipment itself suggested something darker. This is where the story flips. The burden quietly moved from the state explaining lethal force to the deceased explaining his own death. Notice what's missing here. There was no sustained focus on agent decision-making, no prolonged public examination of tactics. The spotlight stayed fixed on Pretti's carry, not the moment force was used. And that omission isn't accidental, because once the object becomes the villain, the actor disappears from scrutiny, and that opens the door to something far bigger than one case. Once that logic takes hold, escalation becomes easy, because the question stops being was lethal force necessary and turns into what did the civilian do to invite it. And from there, the scope widens fast. The framing no longer applies only to Alex Pretti. It starts to apply to anyone who is armed near federal authority. This is where the situation intensifies. Statements and commentary didn't stay confined to this one encounter. The implications spread outward, suggesting a broader rule, that proximity plus a firearm equals danger. Historically, that kind of reasoning has shown up during moments of stress, when institutions feel exposed and need a clean justification. Not nuanced, clean. What's being normalized here is subtle but dangerous. The idea that lawful behavior can still be lethal if it creates discomfort for the state. Carrying a firearm remains legal on paper, but conditional in practice. Conditional on who sees it, conditional on how they interpret it, conditional on how fast things move. Now watch how fast this escalates. Once this standard is accepted, there's no clear line anymore. The same act can be protected one moment and fatal the next, depending on who controls the scene. And that's the shift. Lawful carry doesn't disappear. It just becomes unstable. And instability is where precedent is born. Then came the moment that permanently changed how this was understood. A senior federal prosecutor, Bill Asaley, didn't just defend the agents involved. He articulated the logic out loud. He said that if you approach law enforcement with a gun, there is a high likelihood they will be legally justified in shooting you. That wasn't a reaction in the heat of the moment. That was a rule being stated. Read that carefully. The act isn't firing. It isn't threatening. It's approaching. With a gun you are legally allowed to have. In one sentence, lawful carry was reframed as a trigger for lethal force. Here's why that detail changes everything. Because this wasn't a stray comment. It aligned perfectly with the earlier messaging that focused on Pretti's equipment instead of agent behavior. Words and actions snapped into place. The shooting was no longer an exception. It was an example. Notice the contradiction. Publicly, the right to carry is celebrated as fundamental. Operationally, that same right is treated as a justification for preemptive violence when federal authority feels exposed. Those two positions cannot coexist cleanly. And once that contradiction is spoken aloud by someone in power, it doesn't stay theoretical, it becomes guidance. And guidance shapes behavior long before any court weighs in. After that, the situation compressed. Multiple pressures stacked at once, and the system started moving faster than any single actor could control. Gun rights organizations reacted, but selectively. Statements came out condemning the prosecutor's framing as dangerous. At the same time, the administration itself stayed insulated. Criticism flowed downward, not upward. Meanwhile, the earlier messaging didn't retreat. The focus on Pretti's lawful carry remained intact. No broad walkback, no reframing, silence from the top where clarity might have cooled things down. That silence mattered, because it signaled that the conflict wasn't a misunderstanding. It was being managed. This is where speed becomes the story. One death, immediate narrative lock-in, partial backlash, strategic restraint. Each piece added pressure without releasing it. No single crisis, a stack of them. And here's the destabilizing part. When institutions move this fast, they stop correcting themselves. They double down. The goal becomes containment, not truth. And once containment is the priority, consistency with past principles becomes optional. So ask yourself the question that's now unavoidable. Now pull the camera back to where you are, because this isn't happening in briefing rooms or court filings. It lands in ordinary moments. You're at a gas station, a parking lot, a public event. You're legally carrying, doing what the law allows, maybe what you've always believed was responsible, and suddenly that same legality feels conditional. The message filtering out is quiet but powerful. Lawful doesn't mean safe. Not if the wrong authority feels threatened. Not if the situation moves fast. Not if your presence is reinterpreted after the fact. That uncertainty changes behavior. People hesitate. People second guess. People stop intervening, stop helping, stop stepping forward. This is where the Good Samaritan label matters. Because if stepping in while armed can be retroactively framed as malicious, then the cost of involvement becomes unpredictable. You're no longer weighing right versus wrong, you're weighing survival. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments. Not as a political statement, but as recognition. Because once people start internalizing that risk, the effects don't stay theoretical. They reshape how society functions in real time. And that's when a single incident becomes something systemic. Here's the unsettling part once the emotion fades. This isn't about ideology. It's about incentives. Systems behave in predictable ways when their authority is challenged. When a civilian with a weapon enters the frame, the system doesn't see a citizen exercising a right. It sees a variable it can't fully control. Federal power is built around predictability, chains of command, rules of engagement, clear authority. An armed civilian, even a lawful one, introduces uncertainty. and uncertainty is treated as risk. So the system responds the only way it knows how, by narrowing the definition of acceptable behavior after the fact. This is how rights erode without being repealed, not through legislation but through interpretation. The law stays the same, the consequences change, carry remains legal, but the cost of carrying quietly rises, enforced not by statutes but by fear of escalation. This is why the response sounded coordinated, because it wasn't about one man, it was about reasserting control, about signaling who gets to decide when force is legitimate, and once you see that mechanism, the story stops being shocking, it becomes logical, and that's what makes it dangerous. From here, the trajectory splits and neither path is clean. In one direction, the messaging hardens. Lawful carry remains protected in speeches and court filings, but operationally, encounters like this become more common, each one justified individually, each one explained as unique, until the pattern becomes undeniable but normalized. In the other direction, pressure builds. Not loud realignment, but quiet withdrawal. Fewer people show up, fewer people volunteer energy, money, turnout, not because they switched sides, but because enthusiasm drained out. The support stays on paper, but momentum leaks away. Notice what hasn't happened yet. There's been no decisive correction, no clear statement drawing a hard line between lawful carry and lethal force. That absence matters, because systems tend to keep moving in the direction of least resistance. And right now, resistance is muted, fragmented, cautious. This is where uncertainty does the work. Everyone is waiting for the next case, the next video, the next justification. And in that waiting, the next move is already forming, shaped by what was allowed to stand the first time. One man's death exposed a rule that was never written down. When authority feels threatened, rights become negotiable, not in theory, in practice. That's the real frame. This wasn't about guns versus law enforcement or left versus right. It was about which principle gets protected when two of them collide. And the answer came fast. The institution closed ranks. The narrative followed. And a lawful act was turned into justification after the fact. Here's the loop to sit with. Rights don't vanish all at once. They become unstable first, conditional, dependent on context, speed, perception. That's how they fade without anyone announcing it. If you want to understand where this goes next, don't watch the speeches. Watch the next encounter. Watch how quickly the explanation forms, because the pattern is already set.